Hello, everyone, and welcome to Complete College America's webinar with the Montana University System. I'm going to give everybody a minute to be able to log in and join us, and then we will get started as soon as possible. Hello again, everybody. This is Vanessa Cato with Complete College America, and I am just giving everybody about 30 more seconds to log in, and then we're going to get started. Okay, hello everyone. As I said, my name is Vanessa Cato, and I have the pleasure to serve as the Senior Strategy Director at Complete College America. Thank you so much for joining us as we at Complete College America have the absolute pleasure to highlight the efforts of the great state of Montana. As one of our leading alliance members, Montana, who is proudly led by the folks at the Montana University System, is always innovating for the good of their students. And today we get the privilege to hear from Brock Turner, the Deputy Commissioner of Academic Research Policy and Student Affairs, Christine Miller, Student Success Specialist, and Joe Teal, Director of Academic Research and Policy, about their new initiative, the Montana 10 Project. I'm just going to do a brief little round of housekeeping before I turn the mic over to them. Right now, we are going to take questions at the end of their presentation. So feel free to place your questions in the chat box or use the designated question and answer feature on the webinar tool. I will moderate the question and answer session once the presentation is over. So feel free to use it as they're talking so you don't forget your question, but we'll get to it at the end of the presentation. This webinar is going to be recorded and placed on the Complete College America web platform at completecollege.org, as well as emailed out to the attendees so you can review it again or share it with your colleagues. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Brock, Christine, and Joe.
Well, thanks a lot, Vanessa. Thanks everyone for joining us on this webinar. This is Brock Tessman here, a Deputy Commissioner with the Montana University System. And I'll tell you, we've had the opportunity to sit in on a number of these webinars and find them to be incredibly helpful. So it's an honor to be on the other side of the phone, so to speak, and to be able to share some of our ideas with you all. And I would note that it's also an honor for Montana to be such an established member of the Complete College America Alliance. We're very proud of the work we've done and really excited about our next chapter in partnership with CCA. I think we're going to start with some, again, very brief introductions, and we'll end with Christine, who will begin the formal presentation itself.
So I'm Rebecca Power, Academic Initiatives Analyst here for the University System.
Hi everyone, I'm Joe Teal, Director of Academic Policy and Research.
Hi, this is Christine Miller, the Student Success Specialist at the Montana University System office. And Vanessa didn't mention Rebecca earlier because Rebecca is very new to our team, but we are very grateful to have her. She brings a lot of campus experience to us and also a lot of student success experience, and she will be a big part of this project going forward. I also want to take just a minute to introduce three other important people who are really significant in Montana Project 10, and those are our three leaders at each campus who are kind of leading the charge and implementing this project. Amy Capilupo, they all have other positions and jobs, by the way, also, as you'll see up here, but Amy Capilupo is our project lead at the University of Montana, and she brings an immense and amazing background in advising and really just an intricate knowledge of how students, the many, many points where students are connected to the university and where interventions and support can happen successfully. We also have Sandy Bauman, who's the Associate Dean at Helena College. She's our other project lead at our two-year campus. She actually brings a wealth of knowledge on this, as her dissertation work was about programs like Montana Project 10, so we're really glad to have her expertise and leadership on a campus. And then our third campus leader is Laura Giddings-Carlson at MSU Billings, our third and final campus, and she's the TRIO director there. And as many of you probably know, particularly at smaller campuses, any kind of student success effort really needs to be coordinated with the TRIO offices, and so we're really glad to have Laura as part of this team. Okay, so now you have kind of a better sense of who our team is, and I guess I should also say quickly that Joe and I have really been kind of the drivers behind this project, and with the leadership of Brock, and we're really grateful for his guidance and kind of pushing all the appropriate levers where needed, and also being kind of at the forefront and a champion of this project from its seed stages. And Rebecca, as I mentioned, will be along to support us and help do all of this work. So today, I think that we just want to give you some pretty broad brushstrokes of Montana Project 10, and then also get into a little bit of details about what the project framework is, what the context of our system is, and then kind of zooming out a little bit more what it means to do student success in a frontier state. So I'll start very briefly by explaining Montana Project 10. It is a student success pilot program aimed at increasing retention and completion for Pell-eligible students. The 10 is for 10 integrated student supports with a hopeful 10 percentage point increase in retention and a 10 percentage point increase in completion. As many of you will probably recognize, this program, this pilot, is modeled after some very successful programs, especially the CUNY ASAP model and in its replication, the Ohio SAIL program, but it also borrows from and is really informed by a homegrown model in our state at Montana State University in Bozeman, and that's called the Hilliman Scholars. It's kind of a similar approach to comprehensive student support. So just very briefly, that is Montana Project 10. So we're going to go through kind of our motivations for this, what it is, why we're doing it, what our system looks like, and then finally, as I said, what a frontier context is.
So starting with motivation, you know, I think our motivation can really be captured in this chart. And for those of you listening across the nation, if you were to develop similar charts for your states, it's likely they would look similar. So we all know that too many of our students drop out, and a high proportion who drop out do so having taken on debt. What this chart is trying to demonstrate is that those trends are more stark among underserved students, among low-income students, among those groups of students who we most want to serve. So in Montana, among Pell-eligible students, 60% drop out, 50% drop out having taken on debt.
So Joe very briefly kind of went through our motivation for this pilot, and I do want to emphasize that it is a pilot, and Joe's going to talk about what that means to us in just a little bit. But very quickly, what this program is and what it does in this current iteration is that it will serve 300 Pell-eligible Montana residents at 3 campuses across our system. Those 3 campuses, University of Montana, Montana State University Billings, and Helena College. And each student who is part of this program will get a very specific sequenced set of interventions aimed at increasing retention and completion. And of course, it comes at a cost, but we're very confident that that cost will pay off, and we're hoping to be able to make that case, and I think we will based on the evidence that the program is modeled after. But it costs about $2,000 to $3,000 per student per year, And that range is just indicative of the different tuitions at the 3 participating campuses. And of course, it's about retention, it's about completion, but really going back to the graph that Joe just talked about, for us, this project is about equity, and it is about the attainment gap and the debt load that low-income students leave our campuses with. And so when we talk about this project and talk about what student success means and the different interventions that get us to retention and completion, equity is always the centerpiece of that, and that's really what is driving us, and also partially why we're focusing on this particular population of students in our state. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe. Well, let me actually back up a second. I'm going to talk really quickly about what the framework actually is for Montana Project 10. So you'll see here that there's kind of 3 categories of interventions: financial support, academic momentum, and purpose and belonging. And you'll probably look at this list and wonder, like, what is so different about this? Because whether you're at a campus or whether you're in a system office like ours, you probably think that your institutions have many or all of these things. But really the theory of change that Montana Project 10 is operating on is that these are integrated in a really specific way. So just to give you 2 examples of that, if you imagine a student who is starting a Pell eligible, maybe first-generation student who's coming from a small town in Montana and arriving at a campus where, you know, they don't know what that's like to be in an urban setting, first of all, and at a campus that's maybe bigger than their hometown. Going full-time is necessary, right? Like, we know that that's a strategy, that if you go full-time, you have a higher chance of on-time completion. But we also know that particularly for our Pell-eligible students, being able to financially afford that is really difficult. And so this program pairs a scholarship with the requirement that students attend full-time, and so it gives them the support that they need to be able to do the thing that we know has good outcomes. Another really key piece of this in the program model is incentivizing the kinds of activities that we know are impactful and that we know help students develop purpose and belonging. So part of the model is high-touch advising, career development, tutoring, and all of those activities are incentivized through monthly incentives that students get for making use of those activities. So Joe's going to talk a little bit about our other theory of change operating with this pilot project.
Thanks, Christine. So our other theory of change, the other item that we've narrative approach that we think we can change through this project is really building our system's ability to do student success science. So through this project, we're trying to have a more intentional, rigorous approach to demonstrating our impact, to learning if we don't have the impact that we forecast. And if we do have a large impact, being able to use that, leverage it, to change narratives at the state level about the return on investment for students, for institutions, for the state, of investing in student success supports of these types. So our intention here is to conduct this pilot as a randomized control trial with a rigorous qualitative and quantitative research approach so that we can demonstrate in really concrete terms the impact that we've had. We can document the mechanisms through which we think that impact occurs. And then most importantly, and this is the point I want to emphasize, that we can leverage that evaluation to document the value added by these type of supports for students, for institutions, and for the state. To give you an example of why we're fairly confident, we think it's useful to look at this chart. So this came from the original evaluation of the CUNY ASAP model in New York. This evaluation was conducted by MDRC, and it's showing in a rigorous randomized control trial the graduation impacts of that intervention. And what it shows is after 3 years among these 2-year college students, this intervention increased graduation by 20 percentage points. And so our question is, if we're able to replicate this effect, if we're able to improve graduation by 20 percentage points, what is that worth to the state in terms of economic development, fewer students leaving with debt or perhaps leaving unable to pay off the debt that they've accrued during college? What's it worth to the state in terms of a higher proportion of our population with higher education? What's it worth to our state and students reaching degrees more quickly, taking less state resources on the way? And just to talk through that a little bit more, this is another way that we're trying to talk about, track, and understand return on investment, is the value of on-time completion. So students at our bachelor's degree institutions who complete on time are spending close to $10,000 less than students who complete at the average time, and close to $30,000 less than students who complete within 150% of usual time. Not shown here is the value of on-time completion for the state, which each year that a student is attending is providing state resources, state subsidy to educate these students. So our overall hope is that by conducting a rigorous evaluation, we both can understand how and why this intervention works, and can use those results to really demonstrate and argue for further resources to support interventions of this type, changing the narrative on return on investment.
Well, that's right, Joe. I'm really glad you brought up that last point. I may get to it a little bit here myself. What you see in front of you is, I think, kind of a flow chart of system influence. And what I'll tell you is that everyone in this room, and I bet a lot of folks on the webinar right now, we may have started or actually had a large part of our experience on individual campuses. And I know in moving to the system office, I wondered exactly how I'd be able to have a direct impact and move things forward as easily here in Helena as I would have on a campus. And I've really come to appreciate that that's absolutely what a good system does. Nancy Zimpher, a longtime SUNY chancellor, also a university president and chancellor, really is pushing the concept of systemness as a great way for public higher education to address some of the biggest challenges it faces and to actually maximize some of the biggest opportunities that are available to public higher education. This is an example of systemness. So you have the torch in the middle. We candidly would admit that it's not our favorite logo, but that is our system logo on the middle. So as we think about the Montana University system, you know, one thing that we believe is that we do exist at kind of a very high altitude compared to some of our campuses, and it allows us to not only read a statewide context, but also understand the national context, and to combine those two in order to set important priorities for the Montana University system. Joe was just talking about the importance of redefining value and recapturing the value narrative across the country. A lot of that has to do with retention and completion. A lot of it has to do with the way in which underrepresented students, who, by the way, will increasingly comprise our student body, are served and how they succeed as part of our system. So we feel like Montana Project 10 is a good example of being able to read the context and set a priority. And the second thing that we can do as a system is really engage the policy levers that we have available to us. There are a few different levers that I could talk about, but I'm going to talk about one in particular, which is performance funding. So in Montana, $15 million a year is set aside for performance funding, largely around indicators connected to retention and completion. There are some additional indicators based on institution type, but largely retention and completion. So for campuses that continue to improve in those areas, they earn their performance funding dollars. But occasionally we'll have campuses that don't improve in those areas, and that money remains unearned. We're actually funding this pilot through unearned performance funding dollars. And I think it's a great way for us to take those dollars and actually funnel them right back to campuses for a very specific purpose, which is to help them make progress in the areas that they need to make progress in. So that's another role that the system office can play. Christine introduced our 3 campus leads earlier, but in reality, there are between 15 and 25 or so people on each of our 3 campuses working directly as part of Montana Project 10. And I believe that our office has been able to connect different parts of campuses that don't often talk to each other, build these teams, and hopefully will help them accomplish some things they might not have been able to accomplish on their own. So we're proud of our ability to catalyze campus action. And Joe is our data guy in the office. Well, I guess one of our data folks in the office, but Joe is always highlighting the system's ability to step back, conduct a rigorous randomized control trial like we're going to, assess progress in certain areas, decide what works best, decide what doesn't work all that well, and then help us iterate, refine, streamline, make sure that as we move forward, the project is supporting students in even better ways. And I'll tell you, even visiting the campuses and letting them know that we're going to give them some breathing room and they had a year to plan and that we would have time to assess and we give them help in that. It was another way in which the system can really come in and offer some relief to campuses that are quite understandably focused on day-to-day fires, so to speak. The last role for the system is perhaps most important. We are the primary advocate and champion for our campuses. We have direct lines of communication not only to our regents, but to our state legislature, to the governor's office. We allow the system to speak with one voice to important external funding agencies. And as we see success with Montana Project 10, I think our system office will play a greater and greater role in advocating for a sustainable funding source and advocating for this new approach to understanding the value of public investment in higher education.
So Brock gave a really good kind of high-level overview of our office's involvement in not just Montana Project 10, but how we see the value of the system office at work in advancing what higher ed means and who has access to it and who can be successful in it. But I want to kind of zoom back in for just a second and talk a little bit about the 3 campuses in our system who are participating in the project. And these 3 campuses are a really important part of the context in Montana and kind of understanding how Montana Project 10 is operating here. I think, you know, as far as the pilot goes, these 3 campuses tell us a lot because they're pretty different. They tell us a lot about which kinds of interventions are working for which kinds of students. And again, that's about equity, but it's also about as we do programming and as we support initiatives and as we advocate for certain kinds of funds or policy change, we need to know if those things are impacting different students in different contexts differently. And so this pilot has these 3 participating campuses, and having that variety really helps us understand that. Not to mention that the other places that similar programs like this have been modeled have largely been at 2-year campuses, though not exclusively, but we have 2 4-year campuses as part of our pilot project, and we think that's pretty exciting, and we're very interested to see how this model operates in those spaces. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the campuses participating. The University of Montana is in Missoula, Montana, and it is one of our flagships. It's a research doctoral institution with around 10,000 students, give or take. It has an embedded 2-year, and it's a residential campus as well. And that's another pretty significant difference from a lot of kind of similar models of this program. Helena College is a 2-year college, a standalone 2-year college. It is largely Pell eligible students. Has a very significant portion of its student population is Pell eligible. It's non-residential, and it has a lot of CTE, a big CTE focus, and is pretty committed to serving the needs of the local community. MSU Billings is a regional 4-year campus. It's also residential. It also has an embedded 2-year. It has that campus has around 2,700 students. And this campus is pretty interesting because it kind of has a mix of the student demographics from Helena College and UM, and kind of combines some of those, like a largely Pell eligible student population, but its mission is also really focused on like health fields and some research going on there. And so it's a really kind of interesting space to think about the different kinds of supports that students there might need and how those supports can be sequenced and implemented in different ways. So that's kind of an overview of our campuses, but there's another really important part of the Montana University System context that has made Montana Project 10 possible. And these are just a few examples, but we've been at work on this pilot project you know, the early months of this year, some kind of brainstorming and data collection and research, maybe going back further. But really, as we take kind of the long view of this project, it's been in the making for quite some time. And I say that partially because we started our partnership with Complete College America, I think, Vanessa, maybe 2013, and really our partnership and the game changers that many campuses in our system piloted and then fully scaled have kind of laid the groundwork for a project like Montana Project 10 to be possible. And so we kind of think of Montana Project 10 as Game Changers 2.0. As you'll have noticed, many of the strategies in Montana Project 10 are some of the game changer strategies that are key to Complete College America's work. Montana has really been at the forefront of some of that work, especially in co-requisite support and math pathways and 15 to finish. And, you know, we were talking the other day about how sometimes people don't really talk about 15 to finish as being like a big push anymore, and at many of our campuses that's kind of just because it has been integrated into regular operations. You know, that it's not to say that we don't have work to do, as I'm sure many other states do, but that is part of the way that we approach student success. It's not, we're not piloting it, we're not trying to figure out how to make it possible. We're in the continuous improvement phase, and so we can take that and make use of it and make use of all the infrastructure that we created 3 and 4 and 5 years ago, and that infrastructure facilitates something like Montana Project 10 to be possible. And then we have other student success strategies that our system has been at work on that are also integrated into this project, primarily, and what comes to mind most often are high impact practices, and in this case that's in the form of freshman seminar and orientation, but we're also really excited to see how high impact practices become part of Montana Project 10, particularly at our 4-year campuses that might have a greater capacity to do undergraduate research.
So, you know, as I think about this overall effort that we're undertaking, as I think about how it builds upon the work that we've done with Complete College America and the significant progress we've made on several student success strategies, the future that I think we're trying to build in our system that we think other systems can take on more and more is a system's role in innovation and a system role in student success science. And we were reflecting as we take this major foray in that direction of the Montana University system being a catalyst for innovative practices, being a purveyor and developer of student success science, of what's been influential thus far, still early days, within Montana Project 10. And these are 5 of the ideas that we came up with. A first important one is lead time, and that's lead time both in terms of planning far in advance for projects that when you're coordinating multiple campuses, when you're developing more complicated student success interventions, you need the lead time to get people on board, ensure that there's space for intentional planning, ensure that you're taking into account the time that a lot of these complexities take. It's so important for us that that this wasn't what sometimes folks see as a shotgun system initiative, but a system initiative where we developed, engaged stakeholders, and said we still have a year to really work on a lot of the details with all of our campuses. The second piece that was important is coming up with a strategy and arguments for important what we would call veto players. So how are we engaging our regents in arguing for the system role in innovation and arguing for innovation in this particular direction? How are we engaging our system lead? How are we engaging campus presidents or provosts and starting to kind of power map for making the argument for what is a somewhat new role for a system office? The third piece was early and intentional stakeholder engagement. And that's both internal stakeholders, looking at campus-level individuals who would be important players in the project. In our case, connecting with MSU's Hilliman Scholars Program to understand what the important things that they're learning in their similar and related effort, and also connecting with external folks, folks at research centers, higher education think tanks, other system offices who are working in this space. And fourth, I think is a challenge in every initiative, but thinking about both seed funding for the start, and as you're arguing for seed funding, which we were successful in doing in connecting this project with performance funding, thinking about how you're going to build the arguments for sustainable funding, which is a really central part of the strategy we've put together. And then finally, and this is kind of a second stage of stakeholder engagement, really intentionally building campus teams and intentionally thinking through how are those campus teams going to engage with this work, engage with each other, how are we going to facilitate that work over time?
Thanks, Joe. And, you know, as Joe mentioned, that's kind of a broad, high-level overview of the stages as we see it for defining and creating and implementing Project 10, and we'd be happy to discuss further some specific things that we've done to that end. But before we get to questions, I do want to take a minute and kind of zoom way out and think about the context of Montana as a state and where our students are coming from, and what we think is unique and interesting and also very challenging as we do Montana Project 10 and as we do other student success efforts in our state. This map that you see here is a pretty good visual of what rural and frontier really mean, and people across health fields and census and education all define that a little bit differently, but you'll see here in kind of the outline of, hopefully many of you know where Montana is, the highest concentration of fewer than 7 people per square mile is Montana. There's a couple exceptions in our urban centers, but what this means to us is that not exclusively, but a significant population of our students are coming from rural areas. And that doesn't just mean that they might have to drive 50 miles or more to an institution of higher education. What that practically means on the ground for our students is that the population of their dorm room when they get to college might be significantly greater than the population of the entire town that they grew up in. And definitely more than their high school. I'm from one of those places, and so this really means a lot to me, and I think about it. I think a little bit differently than I see a lot of conversations about what ruralness means in higher education. I think the way that we might define what being rural means in our state is dislocation. And I mentioned, you know, that students might come from a small town, but I think more than that, there's just some challenges that come along with being dislocated, whether that's really not having access to reliable internet, or if it means that your hometown is a 12-hour drive away, so that you really can't go home and kind of have that touchstone of home in place, or that you come to an urban campus that is radically different from anything you've ever known, and you really don't know how to find purpose and belonging in that state. So there's just some pieces of being rural that pose particular challenges for our students. And especially when we think about our low-income students, alongside being rural or being American Indian, or any of the other kind of equity categories that we think about. What we really have been trying to do with this project in our office and in our office more generally is to think about how those different equity markers intersect with being rural. So what I mean by that is like a student who comes from a low income or is economically disadvantaged and comes to a campus and gets a degree and then intends to go back home or go into the workforce. There's kind of sometimes an assumption there that there is economic development happening for that student to walk into. And in Montana and in really rural places, like where many of our students from, that's not always the case. And of course, there are many, many efforts going on in our office and statewide and through other state agencies and other entities that are working on community and economic development, but it is a real challenge. And so I think you know, that's just one of the barriers that our students face and one of the challenges that we need to better learn to address. And I think part of our work in Montana Project 10 will be doing that.
So thank you, Christine and Brock and Joe. So we're going to start off the Q&A session by actually posing a question to all of you. So one of the distinguishing features of Montana Project 10 is our setting. As Christine mentioned, the rural frontier state of Montana. And we think that Montana Project 10 is one of, maybe even the first efforts of its kind in the rural West. And so we're hoping to hear from all of you, are you aware of other similar efforts in the country, especially in the rural West, or even maybe even pieces of what we've talked about? And this is excluding the CUNY ASAP and the Ohio SAIL programs.
That's a great question. If you guys, if all of the attendees on the webinar, if you do know of anything, feel free to type that into the chat box.
So Vanessa, this is Brock here, and I think I would piggyback on Rebecca's question. We certainly don't necessarily expect full inventory of student success initiatives throughout the country or even in our region. But I guess just to frame that a little bit more specifically, we feel like this is a nice next step for what we know is a successful approach to retention and completion in New York, in Ohio, in some other locations as well. And one of the reasons we think it's a nice extension is because we are looking more explicitly at four-year campuses. But another way in which we think this extends our current knowledge is thinking about the science of student success in rural serving institutions in rural serving states. We've had a lot of talk internally about the development of a kind of rural serving consortium similar to the way in which we know there are well-developed discussions among urban serving institutions. And so this is kind of part of that puzzle. The other kind of thing I would throw out there as perhaps a useful point of discussion is really this notion of our investment in student success. Christine outlined $2,000 to $3,000 per student. In a place like Montana, those are real dollars. It's approaching $1 million here. And that might not be as much in other parts of the country, but for us, that's significant. If we want to scale it, we're looking at maybe 10 times that much per year. Now, if you speak to some of our legislators, they would say we're already spending enough money, perhaps too much money, on higher education, and it would be hard to convince them to invest sustainably in this kind of initiative at a premium. I think Joe's made a good case, and perhaps others could offer some assistance in thinking about the value in terms of the cost per degree, right? What we really see as our business is getting students through to whatever their goal, credential, or certificate, or in this case, degree would be. And not only does that get them through, hopefully faster and with less debt, it puts them perhaps back in their communities or back in a Montana community as productive economic citizens. They're not burdened with debt that may constrain their professional choices, may add stress in different ways. We know through lots of literature that they're happier, they're healthier, probably more likely to be engaged community members. And so our idea is to really think about the state investment per degree produced. And I would throw out as a second question, does anyone know about similar efforts across the country where really we have a system or an institution justifying additional investment because ultimately it is a more cost-efficient way to produce degrees?
Feel free to use the chat box to respond to the questions posed by our panelists. And I would just like to add that I do see that a lot, Brock, with folks that are justifying co-requisite support. I love the integration of your, the specific integration of all of the strategies that you're doing. And so that's a very unique approach to justifying additional expense and the cost per degree produced. And so I think that that's, of course, Montana being innovative. And of course, I'm not seeing anybody in the chat box saying that they've heard of that or anyone else is doing it. And so I'm glad that we're doing this webinar to get that information out there.
Yeah, and I hope that folks will chime in with questions that they have them about the elements of Project 10 or where we are at in its implementation as well. But really for us, I think that there are a couple of big, sometimes existential questions that we're trying to answer. One, as we mentioned, is rurality, being a rural state, and how we're serving students in that context. And that's because if you look at where really robust student success science is being conducted, often it's focused on urban environments. And if you also look at some of the context of, recent conversations on education deserts, those student success approaches that work in urban environments, they need to be translated and adapted into rural environments. And I think that our thought is we need, as frontier and rural states, some way, some coalition, some approach that allows us to do more of that work, because it's going to be more and more important as rural states face the same challenges that higher education is facing everywhere to understand and do that, but perhaps even in more important ways, because if one of our regional rural institutions fails or closes, the students that institution serves do not have alternatives. And as Brock mentioned, the second piece, I think, is really thinking about a whole range of dimensions. We can better articulate the value of higher education and more explicitly the value of investing in student success supports, whether that's because we can have lower cost to degree, whether it's because we're minimizing student debt, whether it's because we're minimizing the time students spend out of the workforce, or whether it's because having higher education institutions contributes in other ways to the economy. We're really thinking how in our state, how in Montana do we build that narrative?
So we have a question in the chat box, and the question is, has Montana Project 10 yielded results that show the integrated approaches utilized don't present the same rate of success with certain populations of students?
So the answer there is, so far Project 10 hasn't, I mean, we're in the implementation stage, so we don't have results in the Montana context at this stage. We do have results from the Hillman Scholars Program, results from CUNY ASAP, results from Ohio SAIL, and generally what those results show is that the more challenges students face, the more impactful these type of interventions are in a randomized controlled trial type of sense, compared to, you know, traditional services on campus. Adding advising for a low-income student, an underserved minority, a certain student from a rural area, adding and integrating advising, tutoring, financial supports are going to be more impactful for that student than they would be for your typical traditional high-income, middle-income student who, you know, kind of the typical college attendee.
Joe, so this is Brock here. I would point out that not only is it absolutely the right thing to do to target interventions toward groups that have not had the same structural opportunities as other groups, but it's also the smart thing to do if you're only thinking about the best way for states across the country to reach the attainment goals that most of us have. And I present this purely as a secondary motivation, but the bottom line is that if you look at entering students into the college environment and say you break them into quintiles, the kind of top quintile being your high-performing, sort of structurally advantaged students, and then the bottom quintile being not as well-performing and structurally disadvantaged students, the area in which you can increase attainment and actually move the needle is in the third and fourth and fifth quintiles. This is where states will typically really offer students a bad deal, and I'm not too embarrassed to say that, you know, you could argue that in Montana, looking at our completion rates, it's a tough sell. Students in those quintiles 3, 4, and 5, they don't have great completion rates, so they are fairly likely to start college, take on some debt, and then not graduate. We have to change that equation so that those students are making it through with the degree that they pursue. And it's the right thing for them and their families and their communities. It also means that we're clearly adding another graduate to our pool of economic contributors, engaged citizens, and I think that's what the attainment goals are really about. So this zone, which is not exclusively the zone we're serving through Project 10, but that zone of students who have a lower likelihood of completing is exactly the zone that I feel state systems should be targeting, because that's where the possibility for real impact is greatest.
Awesome. Okay. Well, same person is asking another question. Do the integrated approaches incorporate involvement from the students' families as well? What a great question.
That is a good question,
Yeah, this is a really good question. So, I mean, I think that these 10 interventions that are the core of the program are that. They are the core, and as the program develops and as it is implemented on campus, certainly campuses might develop some other mechanisms that either kind of meet the needs of a student feeling like they belong. So I guess the real answer is I don't know. Certainly at the campuses that we are serving, like Helena College, for example, is a residential campus, so those students frequently are still living with their families, so they're connected that way. But I think this actually points to another challenge of being in a really rural space, is that families for these students are often like hours and hours and hours away. Like, it is not uncommon for a drive to be 5 hours, and that's pretty, you know, typical. And so, you know, that family involvement kind of in a direct community way is really difficult. You know, similarly with like internet connectivity, students sometimes, I mean, I don't want to make Montana sound like so backwoods, but it really is the case that sometimes students, they can't just pick up their phone and FaceTime their families, because where their families are, they might not have like reliable internet connection that's good enough to video stream.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that just one thought, which I think Christine highlighted well in the presentation. We're undergoing a year-long process now of interrogating and adapting these integrated interventions that have been trialed in other states to our campuses, their different contexts, and our state context. And when we're doing that, the process that we're leading campuses through is to look at a barrier intervention approach. So, we mentioned that in the CUNY ASAP model, a common barrier is, while we know that tutoring, that particularly high-touch advising, that career development activities are helpful for students, a lot of incoming students are busy and have a lot going on in their lives and might not know that those activities are helpful. Also, a lot of advisors are way too busy, have high caseloads, and can't give students the type of personalized approach, building relationships that can provide some of the support that those students either might not have at all from their family environments or might not be able to achieve because of Montana's rural nature. And so we're pairing that barrier of students' busy lives with this approach of monthly incentives and a lower advising caseload. So providing students both an indication and an incentive to use the services and supports that we know are helpful, and ensuring that those services and supports are provided at a level of quality that they can address some of the deeper causes of students not attending full time, students having academic challenges, students dropping out.
Great. I am one of those people who still cannot FaceTime my parents because they live in a rural area, Christine. So I totally relate to that. We have a question from New Zealand. That's very cool. Welcome, Stuart. The cost of scaling is going to be significant. Do you use big data predictive analytics to target? If so, what types of data do you use?
Well, this is Brock. I'll take a first stab at that. And certainly one of our core values with this project, and actually throughout our office, is to be as data informed as possible as we allocate resources and spend taxpayer dollars in impact students. But the answer is sort of yes and sort of no. So here's the bottom line. In Montana, what do you think? Do we have 3,500 or 4,000 Pell eligible students total? So, I mean, that's a large number, of course, but not so large that we can't wrap our arms around that number fairly easily. So this pilot represents a pilot with about 1/10 of the total Pell eligible students in Montana. As we think about scaling it, ultimately we have a fairly clean definition of who we'd like to serve or category, and I think we'll stick with Pell eligibility for right now. Christine didn't get into it. It's actually kind of part of our financial model, I guess, is to use the Pell and cover the gap between that and tuition. But so we don't really need to scale it to an unimaginable extent in order to make the project work. Where the predictive analytics come in, I think, is through the advising in particular. And on one hand, we're a little less reliant on data and predictive analytics because we've dramatically reduced the advising load for our advisors. And I think in our hearts and minds, we would imagine our Project 10 advisors as individuals who really get to know their students and who understand them as individuals. However, we do have a couple of different platforms in the state that can be used in order to get early flags. Faculty can denote whether students are not attending classes. We can look at performance indicators that may suggest that a student might be in a bit of academic trouble. And I think the network of data sharing that we'll build through Project 10 will serve as its own kind of predictive analytics platform. We'll actually have a new set of measures that will allow us to understand over time what combinations of, I guess, warning signs are most likely to challenge a student's ability to persist on any of our campuses. Joe, Christine, I'm sure there's some to fill in, but I kind of think the answer is yes and no.
Yeah, well, and I think that, so predictive analytics is clearly an important conversation at campus levels around the country and apparently around the world. We have some challenges in Montana in that we have institutions that serve place-bound students that are very, very small. So many of our campuses are operating at a scale of, under 1,200 FTE. And for those institutions, the capacity to use, really sophisticated predictive analytics isn't there. What we have found really helpful, I think, as a system is developing shared data systems that allow us to maybe not yet use some of the predictive analytics tool sets that really, really large campuses are developing and using, but rather to pool our student base to understand how different strategies are playing out at different institutions. So as part of our work with CCA, developing common indicators around student success that we can track in similar ways across the system helps us to reflect and to iterate on how different campuses are implementing student success strategies, and then to use that information to make arguments for more resources, for new approaches as we move forward. And that's certainly a lot of the genesis of this project, is looking at our past work, analyzing the data that's come out of many campuses trying similar strategies to build an understanding of what works and what doesn't, and then also to build kind of a theory of the case for what students are we still not serving as well as we would like, and leveraging kind of best practices from other states. What change do we think might be possible if we took a different approach?
Okay, great answers. Thank you guys so much. I don't see any other questions. So is there anything else that the Montana team that you want to add before we say farewell?
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I do have two quick points. One is just to say thank you to CCA and to you for hosting us and for being so supportive of this project and of our other system initiatives. We are just so grateful for your expertise and your network. And really excited to see you and hopefully share more about Montana Project 10 in December. The other point that I wanted to make is that, if we go back to our little timeline slide here, we are always in that number 3 stage where we're building our stakeholders. And as we kind of think about our state stakeholders and our campus stakeholders and our system stakeholders, we're also doing a lot of work to think nationally and to think also regionally. And we'd love to invite all of you and your system and institution partners to be in touch with us and to kind of come along this journey with us in thinking about what it means to serve rural students and to help build a more robust conversation around how we do that. So we would invite all of you to be in touch with us if you're interested in being part of that conversation.
Awesome. And just a plug for Complete College America's annual convening for all of our participants. If you haven't yet and you'd like to register, we'd love to host you. The event is taking place in Phoenix, Arizona in December. So what a lovely place to be in December, December 12th through the 12th, 13th, 14th. And you can register on our web platform at completecollege.org. And that is also where this webinar will be housed after we get it recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So you can find it there. Thank you so much, all of our Montana panelists. This was a wonderful webinar. We can't thank you enough. And thank you participants for taking an hour out of your day to spend with us. Have a good one.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Vanessa.
Vanessa.